All the matter around us can be divided into living and non-living. If we try to find a universal distinction, it would be the fact that life always needs energy. And if an organism cannot use photosynthesis, its source of sustenance is other organisms. In a way, the search for food and the need to avoid becoming an easy meal yourself is the main driving force of evolution. There are countless debates online about whether human ancestors were primarily predators or herbivores. There's no clear-cut answer because it all depends on time and place. Over millions of years, the diet of the Homo genus changed multiple times. In tropical regions, people had access to a variety of plant foods year-round. But in northern latitudes with long winters, surviving as a vegetarian was nearly impossible. However, the distinction between predators and herbivores isn't always so simple. Many grass-eating animals, like cows, host massive colonies of microorganisms in their stomachs. These microbes digest the grass, and their hoofed hosts consume both their byproducts and the microorganisms themselves. Humans, on the other hand, are omnivores, which allowed us to sustain our highly energy-demanding brains. Even though we no longer eat insects regularly, our digestive system still contains enzymes that break down chitin. Our species, Homo sapiens, developed the ability to efficiently digest cooked starches, which some researchers believe gave us an evolutionary edge over Neanderthals and other early human species. The advent of agriculture significantly altered the diet of our ancestors. This shift had its benefits, mainly enabling rapid population growth. But there was a downside. Neolithic people didn't necessarily become healthier. In many cases, the opposite was true. The advent of the first civilizations brought large-scale military conflicts, and of course a class of people whose main job became organized killing. Naturally, these warriors had to be fed. When armies were stationed in cities or within their own territories, their diet didn't differ much from the usual local fare. But things got trickier during military campaigns. Publius Vegetius wrote that armies were more often destroyed by lack of food than by battle. Hunger is deadlier than the sword. This was largely because not all foodstuffs could be preserved for long periods, especially considering that all ancient civilizations existed in warm climates. Food poisoning and dysentery could wipe out an army faster than enemy weapons or starvation. That's why, in the ancient Middle East, the cradle of civilization, one of the staple campaign foods was dates. They were highly nutritious and could last for years. In general, the best way to preserve food was often to leave it in its natural form. Grains, for example, can retain their properties for decades. From the earliest times up until at least the Roman Empire, soldiers were often supplied with grain. A key part of their gear included small hand mills for grinding flour. In the 2nd century BCE, Polybius wrote that each Roman legionary received a monthly ration of 26 kilograms of grain, roughly 900 grams per day. That's about 3,000 kilocalories, meaning most of a legionary's energy intake came from grain. The Greek historian Herodian, in his biography of Emperor Caracalla, described how the emperor, during campaigns, would personally grind as much grain as he needed, knead the dough, bake it over coals, and eat it, just like an ordinary soldier. These flatbreads were called panis militaris, military bread. As Rome developed, soldiers were provided with bucellatum, hardtack biscuits made in state-run bakeries and dried using a special method to extend shelf life. Fresh meat, which spoiled quickly and could cause food poisoning, was rarely a staple in military rations. In the 2nd century, General Avidius Cassius forbade his troops from carrying anything but lard, hardtack, and wine vinegar during campaigns. If he found any unauthorized food items, he imposed harsh punishments. When armies did have meat, it was often in the form of live animals traveling with them. For instance, Alexander the Great's army was followed by large herds of sheep and goats, common livestock in the mountainous regions of Macedonia. However, only nomads whose economy was based on livestock could afford to move vast herds for sustenance alongside their forces. Agricultural states kept smaller herds, usually slaughtered only before major battles. Many of you probably grew up hearing that you need to eat meat to be strong. Animal protein is considered complete because, unlike many plant-based proteins, it contains all essential amino acids. It helps repair muscle fibers and build new tissues. However, muscle fuel is glycogen, carbohydrates. If you eat bread, porridge, fruit, root vegetables, or any greens, your body converts them into glucose. During lipolysis, fats break down into substances that can also be used to synthesize glucose. In fact, about 60% of the amino acids and proteins can be converted into sugar. the actual protein requirement for a human is not that high. An athlete aiming to build muscle needs roughly 1.5 grams per kilogram of body weight, assuming their weight isn't mostly fat. For someone weighing 70 kilograms, that's just over 100 grams of protein per day. The general recommendation for an average person is about 1 gram per kilogram of body weight. There's also a concept called the protein minimum. This is the bare minimum protein intake needed to maintain nitrogen balance and basic bodily functions. It's around 30 to 40 grams per day. If a soldier ate roughly a kilogram of bread products, they'd get 70 to 80 grams of protein. Of course, as I mentioned, plant protein lacks some essential amino acids, which is why soldiers often ate lard. Besides being a fat source, it contained about 3 to 7 grams of animal protein. Another common addition was long-lasting cheese and salted cottage cheese. Still, the main staple of a soldier's diet was dry biscuits and flatbreads baked over coals. But don't think ancient warriors just choked down dry bread. It was usually eaten with lard or olive oil. Sometimes they made paksimati, biscuits soaked in wine and flavored with olive oil. Soups and stews were also a part of their diet. Nomadic peoples, for instance, had dried, sometimes ground meat called borts, as well as kurut, hard, salty cheese. Meanwhile, for farmers, bread was the primary food source. This remained true well into the Middle Ages. French historian Philippe Contamine categorized soldiers' diets into 3 types: peacetime, military campaigns, and sieges. During peacetime, according to 15th century records from the Murad estate, a soldier's daily ration included about 1.25 kilograms of grains, more than a liter of wine, 400 grams of meat or fish, plus small amounts of cheese and oil, adding up to over 5,600 kilocalories. For comparison, the standard daily intake for a modern Russian soldier is about 4,250 kilocalories. NATO soldiers reportedly get around 3,600 kilocalories daily, increasing to 5,000 during active combat. Past soldiers likely needed more calories due to the lack of mechanization and the sheer amount of manual labor required. During medieval campaigns, soldiers' diets changed. Meat became less available, and surprisingly, the most important food item was biscuit. Not the modern sweet kind. Back then, it was a simple flatbread made from flour, water, and salt, sometimes with dried meat. Rye, millet, and wheat were milled for biscuits, while peas and beans were used in soups and stews. Even during the Crusades, European armies relied on biscuits made from a mix of barley, legume flour, and rye, which increased protein content. Dry flatbreads have been around for ages. Egyptian sailors baked thin, long-lasting breads called dura. By at least the 12th century, bakers were producing extremely dry, fat-free, hard biscuits that were baked multiple times to remove all moisture. These tough, flat biscuits, also known as hardtack, became a staple food for both medieval and early modern sailors and soldiers. For example, Napoleon's soldiers received a daily ration of 750 grams of bread and half a kilogram of hardtack or dry biscuits. Just like in the Roman and medieval armies, the bulk of a soldier's calories came from flour-based foods. The Brockhaus and Ephron Encyclopedic Dictionary even has an article on military rations, explaining that during wartime and long marches, fresh bread was replaced with hardtack because it lasted longer and was easier to transport. The daily ration was about 900 grams per soldier. When stocks needed replenishing, troops often baked their own biscuits, and during war, some were stored in backpacks while the rest were transported by supply trains. In 1903, a military biscuit factory was built in what is now Novosibirsk to supply the army. Even though the Frenchman Nicolas François Appert developed a method for long-term cooking of meat or vegetables, pasteurizing the product in brine and packaging it in jars in 1809, for which he received an award from Napoleon himself. This technique only became widespread in the early 20th century during World War I. Even then, until the mid-20th century, armies relied more on flour-based foods than canned goods. Today, modern preservation techniques provide military rations with a variety of long-lasting meals, including porridge with years-long shelf life. But traditional hardtack and dry biscuits haven't disappeared. They remain a key part of many military field rations even today. When it comes to foods that can last an insanely long time, anywhere from 5 to 20 years, the high-tech packaging is really just a modern take on an old idea. Most emergency rations are basically a mix of flour and fat, often resembling a dense biscuit. A good example is the Siberian hunter's Mertzovka. This was a compact ball made from crushed dried bread, salt, and lard, rolled into a solid ball and dried. It could sit in a backpack for years as an emergency stash. Of course, people have come up with all sorts of long-lasting foods. Native American tribes, for instance, made pemmican, a mix of dried meat and fat. But for settled farming societies, the most accessible and common staple was always some form of bread or dry flatbread. And bread truly was the foundation of a soldier's diet, providing the bulk of their energy.